Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Ferguson. I am an instructor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. I am also a neuroscientist in the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I am joining you from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm very thrilled to kick off this Neurospirituality webinar series. Why spirituality? That's one of the first questions that I get, particularly working in the scientific community. Spirituality is something that is considered, unfortunately, it's often considered to be antithetical to science or to the scientific process or scientific methods. And there's an implicit question in here that isn't pure rationality sufficient? What's lacking with what's lacking with reason and with empiricism that we ought even explore something like spirituality? So I want to pose a question to you. Which is more likely, that intelligent mud can fully understand the complexity of the matrix that brought it to life, or that there is more going on in the universe than our rational faculties can understand? And let me rephrase that one more time, because this really is the crux of so many of the things that we're going to be talking about, not only in this particular webinar, but in the subsequent webinars of the series. Which is more likely, that intelligent mud, if you take seriously the evolutionary biological proposition, we are mired in the matter of the earth and have risen to this point of intelligent faculties. Given that we have evolved and are now assuming some form that is able to participate in intelligent processes, is it likely that we're going to be able to understand the complexity of this matrix, of this environment, of this system that brought us to life? Or is it more likely that there is going to be, both without and within, more than our reason alone can understand? And this, to me, lays out a very logical argument for why we ought to suppose that our faculties of reason and rationality alone are not going to be able to circumscribe and encapsulate all that is happening in the universe, both without and within. Grounding our metaphysics here, we're going to start by talking about spirituality as interiority. And this has a very long-standing tradition, both in Western and in Eastern spiritual systems. There's a classic of Western spirituality known as the interior castle. And this metaphor of the human interiority as a castle is one that I find very instructive and very illuminating. Particularly as a neuroscientist, I tend to think a lot about the networks, the computations, the representations, the information exchange that's happening in the brain, and really think of these circuits as constituting mansions within this interior castle. As we think about the brain, one of the paradigms that is very formative in contemporary neuroscience is the view that the brain is intrinsically organized into anti-correlated networks. For example, we have networks that participate in external attention, and also internal attending or internal attention. So here we go. The networks that participate in external attention are generally referred to as task-positive networks, whereas the networks participating in internal attention include the default mode network. It's a little bit of an unfortunate name because it's not very descriptive. It's called the default mode network because it was observed that when human beings weren't doing anything else explicit, there was a network of the brain that consistently became more active. And so since this network became more active in a default state, as it were, it came to be known as the default mode network. This view that networks are organized in anti-correlated pairs means that when one network has activity levels that go up, its anti-correlated coupled network has activity that goes down. And you can start to imagine the brain being full of these seesaw-like networks. Now, since the default mode network deals with internal attention, it fits very nicely into this spirituality model as interiority. Throughout the course of this webinar series, I'm going to be introducing some of the classic works, both from Eastern and from Western traditions, that are looking at the interior features of the human being. And we're going to be looking at how those may relate to neuroscientific understandings. In her spiritual classic Interior Castle, Teresa of Avila specifically says that mental activity of recollection is a way for the soul to enter into itself, to use her language. And this is very fascinating for a number of reasons. Some of my recent work on memory circuitry demonstrate strong relationships between the hippocampus and particular subunits of the hippocampus and this default mode network. And this is something that's also been demonstrated by other studies as well, that our memory systems and our default mode network are highly related with one another. So from a neuroscientific point of view, it's very interesting that you have these mystics and these spiritual authors who hundreds of years before we have any brain scanning technology are beginning to identify these relationships of recollection and memory and this inward process of entering into our own interiority. That's some of the rationale that I have to justify really giving spirituality serious attention. But why neurospirituality? Why ought we to bring the brain into this? And I'm curious what you think. If you have any particular insights or any particular motivations for why we ought to bring the brain into this topic of spirituality, feel free to put those in the chat. I would be very interested to hear how you're coming at this and why this particular fusion of topics appeals to you. As some of you are responding to this question about why neurospirituality, why fuse the two together, I'll share some of my thoughts. Yes, our interiority can be thought of as an interior castle, but this interior castle is also a maze. So a proposition is that the more tools of empiricism, of looking at things that we can observe with our sensory faculties, and the more tools of rational inquiry that we have to assist us in navigating our interior castle, the better off that we will be. A disclaimer is that we are not going to reveal and solve all of the mysteries of the human brain and spirituality in one night, but a reclaimer is that the mysteries of the brain and spirituality are, so far at least, a thoroughly inexhaustible well of joyous energy. This effort to really integrate spirituality studies and contemporary neuroscience is something that is so, I would call it life-giving. It's just joyous and it's motivating. Three of the big principles that I want to introduce tonight are: one, scale-free dynamics; two, something called phototropism; and three, humility. What are scale-free dynamics? In general, scale-free dynamics are principles that we can observe at a very, very particular and specific level, but that we can also see reflected at larger and larger and larger levels. And something that is a truly scale-free dynamic is a pattern that we can observe all the way down from the quantum and subatomic levels up to a universal level. We got some great input from the chat here. So, okay, Carson is saying that as far as why it's motivating for us to fuse neuroscience and spirituality with one another, he suggests that as science advances and a non-dualistic nature becomes more and more of an explanation for the mind and consciousness, then why wouldn't the mind and all the components, including the normal flora of the body, be the source of spirituality, even if that includes things beyond what we've considered or can understand? I would fully agree with that. And It's interesting. One of the things that really jumps out to me is this phrase, source of spirituality. And I would argue that, yes, that as we go deeper into understanding the brain as a source of spirituality, I anticipate that we're going to end up seeing these interrelationships wherein the brain, in many ways, is actually reflecting back to us principles about the greater universe and the greater world. We'll go into that in a lot more detail, particularly in the March neurospirituality session. Then Holly suggests if the intersection of spirituality or faith and science are, Holly says the intersection of spirituality and faith and science are constantly at odds. So can spirituality confirm science? Or can science confirm spirituality? And this is a very fascinating dialogue between spirituality and between science. One would assume, or I would argue, that truth ought to be compatible with any mode of inquiry. If we're coming at truth from these spiritual processes and ways of knowing, or if we're coming at truth from these scientific processes and ways of knowing, then something that is actually valid and sound about things as they really are ought to be harmonious in either of those ways of knowing or perceiving. There's that phrase that that steel sharpens steel. And if we're looking at epistemologies, at ways of knowing that are typically thought to be competing with one another, well, all the more reason to put them in conversation with one another so that the things as they really are emerge triumphant, so to speak, if there is this clash between systems and ways of knowing. And then another great contribution from Hope. Hope says the brain and the mind are inextricably linked. Even spiritual dualists believe this. And even radically reductionistic materialists agree that there are aspects of the human psyche for which we don't know the underlying system, and that the body, including the brain, undergirds our mental processing in key ways, since disruption of the body can affect our minds. Excellent points here. Hope concludes, this relationship is unclear and worthy of study for everyone, since the mind is the lifeblood of every human life. Fantastic thoughts, fantastic contributions. I love this. Jumping into this idea of scale-free dynamics, one example that I want to give to you of scale-free dynamics are the principles of blooming and pruning. Here are some depictions of the connections between neurons in the brain from a newborn's brain through the developing brain all the way into adulthood. And on a large lifespan developmental perspective, there is a trend wherein there are more connections between neurons as we move from a neonatal phase into a phase of childhood. And then these neuron connections that have bloomed so prolifically across the lifespan have a trend of pruning into adulthood. And the ones that have the most functional utility are the ones that are preserved and retained. All right, so here's another depiction of from birth to 6 years. You can see that there are many connections that bloom on this whole brain average scale of perspective. And then moving into adolescence, that there's this pruning. Now, we're looking at really slow timescales here across years, but this blooming and pruning process also occurs at micro timescales. There are different activities or different substances or different stimuli that cause blooming to occur more rapidly. Meditation is one of them, for example. The entire field of neuroscience looking at the effects of psychedelics is realizing that there are a lot of blooming properties that are accelerated with these exogenous substances. And it's really beautiful to me that if you look a little bit poetically, a little bit metaphorically at this blooming and pruning process, it has a resemblance to breathing, that it's metaphorically a breathing of the brain into form and an exhalation back into this pruning. This is interesting to me also for a number of reasons. One of them being that across cultural traditions, the breath becomes a symbol of the spirit. In Hebrew linguistics, in Greek, the pneuma, in certainly in Eastern philosophy, the breath is so tied to this sense and this notion of the spirit. In Latin, spirare, the word of breath that for which our English term spirituality is derived, that there's something about this breathing in, this breathing out, and this being a cyclical process that cultures the world over have recognized as being fundamental and core to that which we identify with our English term spirituality. And I think that there's also a metaphor here of the brain and the art of bonsai. Here you have a depiction, again, of blooming and then of guided pruning. And these cycles of blooming and pruning in the art of bonsai allow the individual who is sculpting the brain to sculpt new form into the structure of the tree. And we can think then again to extend this metaphor of the brain as a bonsai forest. And those things to which we pay attention, those things that we value, those experiences that we're subjected to, as being the trimming agent, as being that which trims and then shapes our brains across our lifespans. So a very speculative concern here that I have is one of over pruning as a cultural factor. If we have cultures that are constantly reducing and constantly negating, I'm concerned, and again, this is speculative, but I'm concerned that there may be some culture to brain effect that then has harmful consequences on the development and the well-being of the individual. So are there effects of hyper-reductive discourse? There is, unfortunately, this dark triad of crises in post-industrialized societies of depression, addiction, and suicide. And again, one of my speculative concerns is that perhaps this is related to hyper-reductive discourse within the culture that is causing us to over-prune connections in our brains. Some of this concern is rooted in the preliminary work that I've done researching the intersections of neuroscience and spirituality. In my graduate school work, I was able to localize spiritual emotions to the nucleus accumbens of the brain. It's a central feature of the brain involved in the reward system, in the dopaminergic system. If you're interested in looking more into this, I would invite you to watch my TEDx talk, This Is Your Brain on God. Once we start to localize in the brain these spiritual emotions to systems that are so crucial for our regulation of mood, for our motivation, and our overall behavior, then very quickly, something that seems esoteric and removed from the materiality of our being becomes very central, and it becomes a core concern for behavior and for behavioral health. All right, so to recapitulate principle one, by carefully studying the specific principles of the brain, we may be able to abstract universal principles of life and of human flourishing. Some examples of scale-free dynamics that I will be exploring throughout this webinar series include these blooming and pruning cycles. I'll just go real big here. If you even think about the universe itself, the cosmology that we have from contemporary physics is that the universe may undergo these cycles of Big Bang and Big Crunch, Big Bang and Big Crunch. It's a blooming and a pruning process in a certain way of looking at it. Memory is something that certainly we can ground in the processes of the brain. And as we abstract what really constitutes memory and how it functions in the brain, there are ways that we can start to consider that at larger and at smaller scales. And also intelligence, particularly as we start to see intelligence as a supervenient phenomenon of networks that have internal synchrony and networks of networks that have coordinated function across them, suddenly we can start to see intelligence, or at least potential for intelligence, popping up in different places, whether that's ecological systems of intelligence, whether that's cultural systems of intelligence, or artificial intelligence. And then more speculatively, and I say speculatively only because these aren't dynamics that have been as well grounded yet in contemporary neuroscience, looking at principles like consciousness or principles like harmony. So especially in pre-modern cultures, this notion of harmony was one that was very core to a way of wellness, a way of being with our own selves, with others, and with the greater world. Big principle number 2 that I want to introduce tonight, phototropism. Phototropism is sensitivity and responsiveness to light. And keep in mind, it's not vision. We're not talking about being able to have images that form from photostimuli. But there are organisms like plants that are sensitive to light, respond to it, and orient toward light. Within Western spiritual literature, so in some of the writings of Paul, the New Testament apostle, he talks about how human beings see through a glass darkly. And also in Plato's allegory of the cave, this notion of light and of artificial light versus true light becomes very central and very crucial to the pursuit of the human being for something that is transcendent. So I'm going to posit that we have a certain type of spiritual phototropism that is essential for our nature as human beings. Within this metaphor of spiritual phototropism, what is the light? What stands in if we start to think a little bit more literally? Would you identify the light of spiritual phototropism as beauty, as goodness, intelligence, as wisdom, as truth, as all of the above? What is it that you feel transcendently drawn toward? What is the metaphorical light toward which you naturally orient? And this notion of phototropism is one that is very, very rich for us to unpack. And then big principle number 3 that I want to introduce is humility. A major pitfall in all of science is subjugating your data to serve your bias. If you go in with an a priori hypothesis, thinking that you already know how things work, you already know what exists, there is this very, very dangerous tendency then to view your data in a twisted and a tortured way so that it validates the biased assumptions that you have going into your inquiry. Now, if this is true for science generally, it is particularly true for something like spirituality, where we're trafficking in values that feel so close to our very core of personhood. There's an ancient dance in the human brain between delusion and divinity. Some of the work that I'm doing right now it's actually in review right now at peer-reviewed journals, highlights very vividly the literal relationship between delusion and between the concepts that human beings espouse and identify as being divine. And I'll very much look forward to talking about this in greater detail as soon as it gets accepted for publication. Within current cognitive science literature, there is this observation that genius and madness share a close association with one another. In a 2012 article by Colin DeYoung, he writes that genius has long been associated with madness in the popular as well as the artistic imagination. And what do genius and madness have in common? And what separates them? This is a perennial question that has really trailed into the conversation for as long as this observation has been witnessed, that genius and madness, divinity and delusion, they dance very closely with one another. My favorite, Teresa of Avila, she says that there are many people who think they're experiencing arrobamiento, or rapture, when in actuality, they're only experiencing abominamiento, or foolishness. We can trick ourselves very easily into thinking that we're connecting to something that is transcendent and profound, when really we're in an echo chamber of our own delusion. How do we break out then? Humility is one of the keys. And I would assert that humility is the queen virtue in both the magisteria of the neuro and the spirituality that constitute neurospirituality. To recap then, the big three principles to contemplate that I want to offer to you are scale-free dynamics, this notion that as we look really closely at the particular, we can gain insight into the universal. This observation of phototropism, of the orientation toward light, and then asking, what is it, if we use this spiritual metaphor of light, that we orient ourselves toward? And then thirdly, humility, and the vital nature of humility as we dare to pursue something like neurospirituality. I'd like to lead us through a little bit of a spiritual exercise. And the goal of this spiritual exercise is to enter into a state of receptive humility, wherein we may obtain fresh insight. Now, since you're likely watching this at home, you don't need to be embarrassed to really allow yourself to relax into this exercise here. No one's watching you. No one's going to be judging you. To motivate the exercise, I want to ask the question, how can anything be added to a cup that is already full? Let's imagine that we have three chalices in our mind. One that represents being, one that represents events, and one that represents persons. Inside of these three chalices is wine. The wine in the cup of being represents our knowledge for what exists. The wine in the chalice of events represents our knowledge of actions, of all the actions in the world. And the wine in the chalice of persons represents our knowledge of others. I'm going to invite you now to imagine turning these chalices over and emptying them. Turn over this chalice of being and dare to empty out your knowledge of existence. Turn over this chalice of events and dare to empty out your knowledge of actions. Turn over this chalice of persons and dare to empty out your knowledge of others. You can even imagine this wine of old knowledge being absorbed into the earth. And as you let this image guide your mind, feel that sense of empty openness. And when you're ready, you can imagine turning each of those chalices right side up, ready to receive new insight and fresh understanding. This is a meditation exercise that I invite you to do anytime that you feel like you're super saturated with chatter or that you're having a hard time getting into that place of receptivity for insight and wisdom. And I will speculate that the more that you practice this type of emptying, the easier that it will become to get into a space where new insight and fresh wisdom start to flow more freely into your mind. I am very excited to share with you the upcoming events that I have for this Neurospirituality series and also for neuromichael.com. In 2021, the March Neurospirituality webinar is going to be on the theme of practical mysticism. The June theme is soul and brain. September, we'll be discussing the spiritual eye. And then in December, the dark night. In tandem with the webinar series, you can check out my YouTube channel. And I'm going to be updating my YouTube channel with content, for example, videos from symposia that I've hosted and organized, from talks that I'm giving. And I'll also be uploading the video captures from these webinars themselves. Here's just a quick teaser so that you can see a recent video from the Soul and Brain Symposium that I organized in November.
So Michael asked me here to give a little bit of an introduction to what's called the extended mind thesis.
So yes, if you want to learn more about the extended mind thesis, Dr. Karina Vold gives an excellent presentation. Again, you can find it on the NeuroMichael YouTube channel. The parting contemplation that I will leave with you is that the light of life lives inside you. And with that in mind, let's live in a way that we encourage one another, intending it. With that, I will say thank you very much, and I will see you all next time.